Good afternoon, everybody. Well, that's kind of you. Thank you. You must know it's my last talk. It's cheering me out of the room. That's what it is. Yes, indeed. Hope you enjoyed the music. Yeah, it's nice to hear Lily Marlene sang by both Marlene Dietrich and Vera Lynn. They're the same song, but so different in many ways. Wilhelm Gustloff. Any hands up? I can't see very well, but hands up. How many of you know what the Wilhelm Gustloff, apart from seeing that photograph, anything about the Wilhelm Gustloff? Okay, one or two people. You've heard about the Titanic, haven't you? Okay, this was significantly worse than the Titanic, but it's a big and a long story. I said yesterday, Dernitz is the person operating the equipment today for me. Big hand for him, please. But there's a whole bunch of them, as you know, and I've mentioned before. Robert, Joe, Adrian. There's a whole bunch of technicians who, without them, we wouldn't be able to do anything. So on my last talk, I'd just like to thank all of them for being such a great support and doing such a great job. Thank you very much, Dennis. And I said to him before I started, this is a really, really interesting story. What's going on in the Star Theatre when I finish? He said, you've got till 5 o'clock. So watch out, because we speakers are constrained significantly to 40 minutes. And it's often very difficult to tell our story in 40 minutes. And anyway, Dennis needs to get his head down before he starts working tonight as well. The ship itself, the Wilhelm Gustloff, well, it was a strength through joy ship. Anybody heard of strength through joy? It was a National Socialist organization that was to get all the people of Germany solidly behind the Nazi Party. So you can see the symbol on the top right there. We're on a Viking ship, and we've heard all about the history of the Vikings and everything. Hitler and his cronies blatantly took Viking symbols and a warrior culture, which was part mythological, in order to give their people, and particularly their armed forces, the power to give up their Christian beliefs. So when you see things like the swastika, which is actually a religious symbol from all over the world, a Sanskrit symbol, a Nordic symbol, it's actually Thor's spinning hammer, is what we see there as a swastika in Nordic mythology. When you see those symbols and the SS lightning bolts, they're a Nordic symbol. The torchlight processions that you see at Nuremberg and places like that, it was Hitler's way of taking the German people from a peace-loving, turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor, Christian background, which was very solid in Germany, to what he believed was a warrior culture where your enemy was always weaker than you were and you were the big, strong person. And it's in everything they did, even in their recreational work, the Strength Through Joy movement. They put on affordable holidays. This ship was built for the Strength Through Joy organization. It was built so ordinary people could go on cruises. And they organized all sorts of other recreations for them through the Strength Through Joy movement. The ship was originally going to be called the Adolf Hitler, and I'll explain in a moment why it wasn't named after him. And as you can see, in 1934, 2.3 million took holidays with the Strength Through Joy movement. By 1938, it was 10.3 million. And this ship was very much a part of it, so it was publicized a great deal through propaganda, newsreels and so on, to the German people as to what the German state was now providing for them out of the goodness of its heart in order to improve their life. In 1939, the ship was requisitioned as a hospital ship in the Spanish Civil War, and it operated first of all, moving people backwards and forwards to Spain, and then in the early part of the Second World War as a hospital ship. And then from 1940 to 1945, it sat in Gdynia, or Gdansk, as we now call it, which is where we're going past to get to St. Petersburg. It sat there as an accommodation ship because the Germans trained all their U-boat crews in the Baltic. So the accommodation that had originally built for cruise passengers was taken over by young recruits into the U-boat arm of the submarine service of the Kriegsmarine. So their training was done in the relatively safe waters for them of the Baltic, because the Soviet Navy never got particularly powerful up until the last months of the Second World War in the Baltic. So she was launched in 1937, and this is a propaganda movie about her launching.
This is the propaganda film of the launch of the Wilhelm Gustloff. His widow smashes champagne across the bow as his name is released for everyone to see, cheering as the ship goes down the slipway. Gustloff worked for the Swiss government as a meteorologist, but he founded the Swiss Nazi Party in 1929, and he put much effort into distributing anti-Semitic propaganda books. Gustloff was shot and killed in 1936 by David Frankfurter, a Croatian Jewish student, incensed by his anti-Semitic activism. Frankfurter surrendered immediately to the Swiss police and was sentenced to life imprisonment. After the war, he was pardoned and exiled. The funeral of Gustloff was a state event with everybody from the senior reaches of the Nazi Party attending, and a train carrying the coffin right the way through from Davos to his hometown of Mecklenburg. Gustloff was proclaimed a martyr of the Nazi cause, and his murder became part of the propaganda that served as a pretext for the 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom.
So the whole ship was named after one man. He was shot in his office. The man just walked in and shot him because he was so disturbed about what he was doing with Jewish propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda in Spain. But they made a big thing, not at the time of his murder, because it was just before the Olympics. So they didn't want to make a hero out of him except for his state funeral. They waited till after the Olympics, and then they used his name a number of times with other so-called martyrs, Horst Wessel and others, to encourage the German people to destroy Jewish property on nights like Kristallnacht, when they smashed all the Jewish shops and so on. So they used it as a vehicle to encourage the German people's anti-Jewish feeling, his murder by a Croatian Jew. But the ship itself starts on its cruise, as you looked at that film, did you notice how they were showing the sort of rooms that we have on this ship, the luxury, the dining room? Hitler was meeting the chefs. Did you see the swimming pool? Unlike the Tirpitz, they had a swimming pool. The swimming pool is actually very sad, and we'll hear about the swimming pool later on. But it had a swimming pool, it was a glorious ship, and you drew lots for your cabin. Regardless of your social status, when you got on board, you drew lots and you were given a cabin depending on what you drew. So here is a cruise, a newsreel that was made about one of its cruises to Portugal and Madeira in 1938.
This is a publicity film of the Wilhelm Gustloff setting off on a cruise full of happy passengers to Portugal and Madeira. The Strength Through Joy organisation, whose symbol you'll see on the funnel of the ship, was supposed to bridge the class divide by making middle-class leisure activities available to the masses. This was underscored by having cruises with passengers of mixed classes and having them, regardless of social status, draw lots for the allocation of cabins. Another less ideological goal was to boost the German economy by stimulating the tourist industry out of its slump from the 1920s, and it was quite successful up until the outbreak of World War II. By 1934, over 2 million Germans had participated in a Strength Through Joy trip. By 1939, the reported numbers lay around 25 million. The organisation essentially collapsed in 1939. But it started in 1933 to provide affordable leisure activities, such as concerts, plays, libraries, day trips and holidays. These rewarded workers with taking them and their families to the movies, to parks, keep fit clubs, hiking, sporting activities, film shows and concerts. Much like this cruise on the Wilhelm Gustloff, arriving in Portugal, where you can see that ordinary working people are being treated like VIPs. It's interesting here that we also have marching soldiers with the passengers waving to them cheerfully. At the outbreak of war, all this holiday travel stopped. Until then, Strength Through Joy had sold 45 million package tours and excursion, had over 7,000 paid employees and 135,000 voluntary workers, organised into divisions covering such areas as sport, education and tourism, with wardens in every factory and workshop employing more than 20 people. The most ambitious programme for the German workers was set up for the production of an affordable car, the KDF-Wagen, which later became the Volkswagen Beetle. This was originally a project undertaken at Hitler's request by the famous car maker Ferdinand Porsche. But when the car industry was unable to meet Hitler's demand that the car should be sold at 1,000 Reichsmarks or less, the project was taken over by the German Labour Front, basically the national union of the German workers. The Volkswagen was sold to German workers on an instalment plan, where buyers of the car made payments and posted stamps in stamp books, and when they were full they would redeem a car. No private citizen ever earned a car. And here we have the Wilhelm Gustloff sailing back to Germany with its happy passengers. A very fine piece of German National Socialist propaganda.
After the war, lots of people had these full stamp books and wanted a Volkswagen. So they went to VW, which of course was reconstituted by the Marshall Plan in order to provide employment in Germany after the war. And the Volkswagen company gave them 200 Deutschmarks towards their Volkswagen Beetle. So every time you see a Volkswagen Beetle or even a Volkswagen, just remember its origins. The Strength Through Joy movement with Ferdinand Porsche doing Hitler's bidding, but the corruption involved in it. They basically raped and pillaged the national union of workers in order to fund this political aspiration to give everybody their own car, in order to brainwash them into believing that National Socialism was actually an acceptable thing. Let's start to talk about the circumstances of the disaster I'm going to talk about. We're just about to sail up, well, we're going to Copenhagen first, but then we're going to sail along the Baltic coast to St. Petersburg. And we're going to pass an area that used to be called East Prussia. It was a very much an area that was exchanged between nations through various treaties over quite a long period of time. But during the Second World War, it was inhabited by ethnic Germans, significantly by ethnic Germans, by 1920 to 1939. And the Nazi Party appointed a nasty little piece of work called Erich Koch as the Gauleiter. And he decided he would Germanize the whole area. So all the street names and the town names and everything to do with East Prussia was suddenly given German names. And they imported people from all over, German-speaking people, from all over Germany and exiled or throughout the local population. So the whole area of East Prussia that you can see in this map, Kaliningrad, Königsberg, Gdynia, Danzig, of course, and you may recall the Danzig corridor that was allowed in the First World War to get to it, became an outlying area between Poland and Russia, the Soviet Union, that was Germanized. After the invasion of Poland and then the invasion of the Soviet Union, it was a piece of Germany that bordered the Baltic, which was relatively safe for training purposes for the Kriegsmarine, for the German Navy, particularly for their submarine force. So they used the Baltic ports as the training base, and they took the Wilhelm Gustloff there and other ships, and they docked them there, and they used them like hotels, as accommodation ships. Trouble was, at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, as the Allies started to advance from the west, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet troops started to advance from the east, this became a hotbed of fear, because everybody knew what had happened in the Soviet Union after the invasion of Russia by the German armed forces, and the terrible, terrible cost that they meted out to the Russian people. And the first German town that was occupied by Russian troops is that little star on the right there. You can't read the name on the screen, but it's a little village called Nemmersdorf. And the Russians took Nemmersdorf, and much like the Germans had been, there's no better word than brainwashed into believing that the Slavic peoples were subhuman and so on, and therefore they dealt so badly with them. The Russian soldiers, the Soviet soldiers, they had seen their families and their towns. Anybody who came to my talk yesterday, I gave you the statistics of the number of people killed in the war against the Soviet Union, the number of towns, 1,700 towns razed to the ground, 70,000 villages razed to the ground. The Russian troops that were coming into German territory had this baggage with them, that they had their families had been killed, their villages had been razed to the ground, and also politically, right up to the top, to Stalin, they were basically told to go in there and do whatever you like. Make it horrendous for the people you're going to defeat. And in Nemmersdorf, they perpetrated what became known as the Nemmersdorf massacre. The purpose of pointing it out is not to point out necessarily the atrocities of either of the sides, because we all know they were horrendous. It's to point out the fact that the Germans actually recaptured the town 24 hours after the Russians had gone in there and destroyed it. And all that was left in the town were old people, children, and women. And they were all massacred in the most horrendous way. Within 24 hours, the Germans had recaptured it. And they found this devastation. And they took a film crew in there, and they made a documentary about the Nemmersdorf massacre, and they put it on all the cinemas throughout Germany, particularly in East Prussia. And what they were trying to do was to put steel into the spine of the civilian population and to make them fight back, to make them harder. In fact, what it did, it made them extremely frightened and made them run. It made them get out of the area as fast as they could. But of course, plans had been made by this vile man, Erich Koch, for a proper evacuation. But he refused to allow anybody to evacuate the area, and he said that anybody who evacuated was a traitor. They were giving up German soil and they would be shot immediately. And indeed, the Germans would hang people from trees and lampposts and wherever and leave a sign around their neck saying that this person tried to run away. So it was the Nemmersdorf massacre that made people, and the publicity that the Germans gave it, that made people start to rush to wherever they could to get out of the way of the advancing Soviet forces and get to the west. And that's why they started to concentrate towards Gdynia, Danzig, Königsberg, the Gulf around Gdansk that you can see there in the middle, because they knew that if they got to Pilau or Gdynia or Danzig or Königsberg, there was likely to be a way back to Germany, back here actually to Kiel, which was the objective, or even to occupy Denmark. So they started moving. 24th of October 1944 was when the massacre took place. I've put two very mild photographs on here for you, because the last thing you want to see after a nice lunch on a pleasant cruise like this is what really happened. But if you want to look, it's freely available on the internet, the documentary that they made and so on, and it is disgraceful and disgusting. But these are the buildings that were destroyed. This is a typical example. All the motorized vehicles had been requisitioned by the military. Nobody had any fuel. You literally walked with what you could carry on your back or what you could pull in a cart. And they were all heading west, trying to get away from the Soviet advance. They were frightened quite correctly. At the same time, Dernitz was trying to implement what was called Operation Hannibal. I talked about code words for operations. This one's pretty obvious, and it needed to be. He needed to move not elephants, but he needed to move a huge number of people a significant distance for actual strategic reasons. He wasn't that interested in moving civilians. That was the Gauleiter's job, Koch. But he wanted to move these submariners and all the technology that was around in those Baltic ports that was developing brand new submarines, the most advanced in the world at the time. So he had this operation to move. But of course, when they started to see the civilians trekking into the ports, they were sympathetic to their plight. So the armed forces started to help the civilians and load them on to the ships that had been put in place for Dernitz's Operation Hannibal. So you had this mixture of military and civilian trying to get away from that part of the world. And it was to safeguard the new submarines that they were developing. And when I talked to you about wolf packs and submarines, I mentioned that the Germans had the most advanced submarines in the world. The submarines they had up in the Baltic that were never really used, only a couple of operations in the Second World War, eventually became the foundation of our nuclear submarines of today. USS Nautilus, the first US nuclear submarine that went under the North Pole back in the 1960s, that was a German electroboat, they called them, a Mark 21 German submarine with a number of modifications. So they had really secret and very, very important stuff up there. And in 15 weeks, 1,000 ships carried up to 1 million civilians and 350,000 military, all the way from these ports in East Prussia to Kiel primarily and to occupied Denmark. The Wilhelm Gustloff was one of those ships. Here you can see on the map on the left the way in which it was happening. That tiny little white line down the middle and the little white area at the top left is what was left of German-occupied territory. All the other territory was occupied by the Allies, and the bright red colours there are the recent advances that were coming up. And here's an electro boat, Type 21, 1945, one of the last ones on patrol. And you can see that looks like a modern submarine. It's streamlined. It doesn't have any armament on the deck to slow it down. It could go underwater for significant amounts of time. They were so far ahead. And here's a picture of one of the pictures of the 1,000 vessels. All sizes of vessels were used in order to get the people out of that part of East Prussia. A couple of years before, just an aside, how many of you remember the film A Night to Remember, which was about the Titanic, the original black and white film? Yes. And then, of course, we had Titanic more recently with the standing on the bow with the music and everything. The Germans were the first people to make a film about the Titanic, and this is it. And it was a wartime film. It was meant to be a massive propaganda film. It was a personal project of Joseph Goebbels, their propaganda ministry, and it was intended to show British and American capitalism was responsible for the disaster. You can get it, it's available. It's interesting because it has very sort of correct aristocratic Englishmen conspiring to do the shareholders out of the White Star Line, out of the ship. It has American financiers who are betting on the stock market, whether the ship will do this or the ship will do that. It's all about a race across the Atlantic as to whether they'll be the fastest, which is why it hit the iceberg so fast, and all those sorts of things. It's all in there. But it was directed by a very famous German director, Herbert Selpin, who got so disturbed by what he was asking to do that he hung himself right in the middle of directing the movie. It was shown in France, but it was never shown in Germany. And it would have cost today £180 million to make. So if you ever get the chance to watch it, just Google German Titanic, I think they call it. And it's actually quite an interesting film, and there's an English subtitle version. But they used the SS Cap Ancona, which is the ship at the bottom there, and they took it out of... It was also operating in a military guise, and they took it out of service for 6 months in 1944 in order to make this film. So that's how concentrated they were. Eventually, in 1945, that ship was also lost with 5,000 mainly concentration camp victims on board. So anyway, let's get back to the Wilhelm Gustloff. She's readied for sea in Gdynia, trying to get back to Kiel with all the submariners and also 150-odd auxiliary nurses as well. And the auxiliary nurses they emptied the swimming pool, and because the swimming pool was a bit like our spa downstairs, it was sectioned off to keep it warm and also to give ladies modesty and gentlemen modesty and so on. They gave that swimming pool to the nurses as their accommodation. So they spread mattresses and hammocks and everything in the swimming pool, about 137 of them. 373, sorry, there it is there. 373 women auxiliaries. The Soviets ended up calling them, they called them Gestapo secretaries, but in actual fact they were nurses. They had wounded soldiers on board, they had civilians, and they had nearly 1,000 U-boat officers and men on board. And the idea was to get them from Gdynia to Kiel, away from the Soviets. So the estimated total of people on board was 10,614. This is actual footage of them loading the ship.
There was increasing unrest on the dock. People were forcing themselves onto the ship. We couldn't hold them back. Sooner or later it would be full and people would be left behind. But nobody wanted to be left behind.
So the Wilhelm Gustloff set sail on the January the 30th, 1945 with 3 other ships. Interestingly enough, she had 4 captains on board. 4 captains. Not a good idea, is it? One of them was the Commodore who was in charge of the U-boat training school and were therefore in charge militarily of the ship as an accommodation ship. Another one was in charge of the destroyer flotilla that was based in Gdynia. One was the captain of the Gustloff, and another captain came on board to ask for just a way out. But none of them would agree who was in charge. The captain of the Gustloff hadn't sailed the ship for nearly 4 years. It had been stuck in port, and he was, I think he was past his sell-by date, I think is the best way of describing him. He certainly wasn't of military age. He's probably about my age, actually. But either way, he was the official captain of the ship. But they had an argument about which way they would go back to Kiel. The Baltic the Baltic was the most heavily mined piece of water in the world at the time. There were various passages that were open, but nobody had a clear map of what fitting where the mines were. So they couldn't agree on a course. They chose the dangerous deep water course rather than the shallows for a number of reasons. Also, they received a message that there were ships that were coming to Gdynia in the opposite direction to pick up evacuees as well. Therefore, they turned their navigation lights on so they wouldn't hit the ships coming in the opposite direction. And of course, being an accommodation ship protecting itself in an enemy harbour, the Wilhelm Gustloff was fitted with guns, and therefore she was a legitimate military target.
They said, to have a ticket for the Gustloff is half of your salvation. It was Noah's Ark.
This is the route that she was going to take, intending to take to Kiel. And this is how far she got. Because at that time, the Soviet submarines, they had been constrained to the Gulf of Finland virtually throughout the Second World War. They had not been able to come out of the piece of water we're going to go into just before we get to St. Petersburg, mainly because of the mines, but also because the Kriegsmarine ruled the waves in the Baltic. And of course, up until the Finns stopped fighting, they had the Finnish Navy to deal with and the Swedish Navy as well. So they did have good submarines, though, but they were the same sort of submarines the Germans had, because the Germans had developed their submarine technology with the Soviets during the 1930s. They called them Stalinets, but they were very similar to the German submarines I talked about a week or so ago. And they now, in 1945, had a relatively free hand in the Baltics. Now, in submarine warfare, the Germans hold the record for the tonnage sunk because, you know, they operated in the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean. They got as far down south as Penang in Malaysia. So they were sinking ships all over the world. But in terms of the loss of life inflicted, as you will find out, the Soviet submariners were top of the list. That's a Soviet submarine sitting at Vladivostok, and they commemorated it with a stamp a few years ago in 1996. The submarine that sank the Wilhelm Gustloff was captained by the deadliest Soviet submarine captain ever. His name was Alexander Marinesko, and he had a really checkered career. On the mission that he was on when he sank the Wilhelm Gustloff, he was waiting for a court-martial. So his incentive was quite high to do well. What he'd been done is he'd been found drunk. He'd failed to report for duty until 2 days later because he had a hangover. And he'd also been caught in a place of disrepute with his trousers down, I think, and arrested by the Soviet military police. So he was facing a court-martial at the time, and what he actually did on this one single mission, he sank both the Wilhelm Gustloff and another ship called the Van Steuben, both of them within 10 days, both of them with, you heard in my Wolfpack talk, those of you who came to it, that submarine and torpedo aiming and so on was not a particular science at that time, it was more an art, and you were either very good at it or not. Well, Marinesko was particularly good at it, as he became the most successful submarine captain in the Soviet Union. But when he came back, he was dishonorably discharged, never rehabilitated until he got into his 50s after the Stalin era, and eventually, those of you who came to my first lecture about Cochrane, he was reinstated just before he died, and he was posthumously awarded their highest honor, the hero of the Soviet Union. But his attack on the Wilhelm Gustloff took place really because he disobeyed orders. He was supposed to patrol a particular area, but under the threat of being shot when you get home, you know, you tend to be a bit more adventurous. So he left the area without any orders, and he knew that the Soviet army was advancing, that the whole Gdansk Bay and Gdynia Bay in East Prussia was a vulnerable area, even though it was sort of out of bounds. So he started hunting in that area, and he found the Wilhelm Gustloff. He managed to he fired 4 torpedoes. Each one had a name. One was called the Motherland. just think what the others were called. He fired 4. The 4th one got stuck in the tube, which is the last thing you want in a submarine, is a live torpedo that won't get out of your tube. That one was called Stalin, which is rather appropriate, I think. But he fired 3, and all 3 hit the Wilhelm Gustloff. One hit the port side in the bow midships right next to the swimming pool with those 372 nurses. 3 of them were actually not in there at the time. So that hit the swimming pool. The second one hit midships right in the engine room, and one hit the bow in the crew accommodation at the front, which immediately closed all the watertight doors and kept that crew in an area where they could never get out of. And only 9 of the 30 lifeboats were capable of being launched because she immediately listed to one side. Isn't a very good subject to talk about on a cruise, this is really. But we are in the Kiel Canal, and the bank is steppable onto, so don't worry. But the ship listed so far that some of the lifeboats could not be launched, and some of them got broken on the side. Water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius, or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill factor at the time was minus 18 degrees centigrade, which is 0 Fahrenheit, with ice flows on the surface. So those people who did get into the water had a very hard time, although a lot of ships came to their aid and rescued the people that they could. But sadly, when everybody, and it was terribly, terribly crowded, as you would imagine. People were, as it was said, it was a ticket to freedom. Terribly, terribly crowded. Everybody was given a life vest, but they took them off because it was so hot between the decks with so many people. Most people had taken their life jackets off, so they didn't have them when the ship went down. And it went down 40 minutes after being struck, so it went down very quickly. Strangely, all 4 captains got off. Sounds like the Costa Concordia, doesn't it? Only the military one was court-martialed, but it was never followed up because it was a disaster and that was all you could do about it.
Nur für die Menschen, die noch Leute auf dem Deck hatten, die wussten.
For those who knew that they still had relatives on deck, they knew that their mother or their children or their parents were on deck. They saw the death of their loved ones.
So down she goes, and you saw the number of people. We think the Titanic was a lot. 10,600 people went down with the Wilhelm Gustloff, and they're still at the bottom of the Baltic. So also, perhaps, one of the conspiracy theories is that in the Wilhelm Gustloff, Erich Koch, that nasty little man I was talking about, he was the man who ripped out the amber room. Those of you who are going to the Summer Palace when we get to St. Petersburg will see the amber room, but what you'll see is a replica that has been built from amber since. Because Erich Koch ripped out the amber, had it all crated up. You may not know that the Baltic has 80% of the world's deposits of amber. And of course amber is a fossilized tree sap, often find lovely insects in it and so on. The amber room was 55 square meters and weighed 6 tons, and it took 10 years to create. I mean, when you see the replica, which is, looks just like the original, you realize why it was called the 8th wonder of the world. It was worth in those days in excess of $250 million. And it was all crated up by Koch to be sent back to probably his own home, but maybe to Goering or to one of the other senior people. The last time it was seen, it was in 27 cases on the dock at Königsberg, ready for transportation. But there are reports from people trying to get on the Wilhelm Gustloff, having to climb over these crates and seeing them on the dockside and seeing them being craned into the Wilhelm Gustloff. There's never been a proper search of the wreck. It's a war grave. Therefore, there's not been a really big search of the wreck. So it's never been thoroughly searched. So don't take it from me that the amber room is in crates in the Wilhelm Gustloff, because there's currently a search going on in mines near Wuppertal for the amber room. So it is somewhere. It has never been discovered. But one of the places that it may be is in the hold of the Wilhelm Gustloff, because of the man on the right here. Let me just talk first of all about Dernitz. Dernitz's plan, Operation Hannibal, to move everybody, the military, from East Prussia back to Germany, was to, first of all, save them from the Soviets. Second of all, save the top technology and the skills they had for the Western powers. Because he still firmly believed, now he had become the successor to Adolf Hitler, he was the leader of the German people, he firmly believed he would be able to do a deal with the Allies. And he set up a new government in Flensburg, in Schleswig-Holstein, in northern Germany, and operated out of the Naval College there at a place called Plön, where my sister went to school, funnily enough, the Royal Air Force School there. We took it over after the war and used it as a school. He thought that he would be able to negotiate with the Allies based on being able to deliver to them not only the submarine technology, but the rocket technology, the jet tech, all this wonderful stuff that the Germans had. He was totally, of course, unsuccessful in trying to do that. But as I mentioned in my previous talk on U-boats, he was not considered a war criminal in the sense of crimes against humanity, and therefore he was only sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, and he died in 1980. Erich Koch, you can tell I don't like him, can't you? Nasty little man who told all his people that if they tried to get out, they would be shot. Well, he got out. He got out quickly. He got out in January, and he got himself taken, forced them to take him back to Germany, hid, and wasn't captured until 1949, when he was captured by the British. They refused to hand him to the Soviets, but because of where East Prussia now is and was at that time, they handed him to the Polish government. He was tried in 1958 for war crimes and sentenced to death, quite correctly in my view. But the sentence was commuted to life because of ill health. This is now from 1958, yeah? There is a suspicion that the Soviets thought he knew where the amber room was and they didn't want him put to death because they hoped he would eventually tell them. Well, he never did, and he managed to survive to the age of 90, having convinced them he was far too ill to be sentenced to death, and he died in 1986. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the greatest maritime disaster of all time. I'm sorry it's such a depressing story to hear on a cruise, but I think you'll agree with me that it's an interesting story about the way people react, the way people are tried, the way politicians sometimes try to steer our thinking, and also about the area that we are passing through and going to during this cruise. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you during the last 2 weeks, and I hope that we meet up on a Viking ship in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.